Hey everyone. Tonight, we're setting aside the busy world of today and beginning a long, quiet journey into the distant past. A journey that will slowly reveal how a vast wilderness eventually became the United States of America. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these relaxing journeys through history. Now dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair or bed, take a slow, comfortable breath, and allow the noise of the modern world to gently fade away. Tonight, there are no busy cities, no highways stretching across the horizon, no skyscrapers reaching toward the clouds, no glowing streetlights, no airplanes crossing the night sky, not even a country called the United States. Instead, imagine standing upon an enormous continent unlike anything you have ever seen. The air is cool and wonderfully clean. Ancient forests stretch farther than the eye can follow. Towering mountains stand silently beneath snow-covered peaks. Great rivers wind through endless valleys before disappearing into distant oceans. Across vast grasslands, thousands of bison move together like dark waves beneath the morning sun. The only sounds are birds singing high among the trees, the whisper of the wind across open plains, and the gentle crackle of a campfire glowing in the darkness. This is North America, not hundreds, but thousands of years before the birth of the United States. Many people imagine this land as empty before European explorers arrived. But that could not be further from the truth. Long before a single European ship crossed the Atlantic, this continent was already home to millions of people. Hundreds of native nations lived here. Each spoke its own language. Each followed its own traditions. Each understood the forests, rivers, mountains, and changing seasons in ways few outsiders would ever learn. For countless generations, these communities built homes, raised families, traded across great distances, and passed their stories from one generation to the next beneath quiet evening skies. They had no reason to believe their world would ever change. Yet, far beyond the endless Atlantic Ocean, another story was already beginning. Kings dreamed of wealth. Merchants searched for new trade routes. Sailors prepared ships for journeys no one had ever completed before. Without realizing it, two completely different worlds were slowly moving toward one another. And when they finally met, history would change forever. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, the kingdoms of Europe were changing. Castles stood proudly above growing towns. Markets became busier with every passing year. Merchants traveled farther than ever before, carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and countless other treasures from distant lands. Among all these valuable goods, spices were perhaps the most desired. A small sack of pepper could cost a fortune. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were treasured by kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants alike. They preserved food, flavored meals, and were even believed to possess remarkable healing powers. Yet obtaining these treasures was neither easy nor cheap. For centuries, they had traveled thousands of miles along ancient trade routes crossing deserts, towering mountains, and powerful kingdoms before finally reaching Europe. Every ruler who controlled part of the journey demanded payment. Every merchant added another price. By the time the spices reached European markets, they had become incredibly expensive. Naturally, Europe's rulers began asking an important question. Could there be another way? Could ships sail directly to Asia instead of relying on dangerous land routes? It was a dream that fascinated explorers across the continent. Portugal searched by sailing around the coast of Africa. Spain, however, became interested in a far more daring idea. What if a ship sailed west, across the enormous Atlantic Ocean, and eventually reached Asia from the opposite direction? To many people, the proposal sounded impossible. The ocean seemed endless. Old maps contained more guesses than facts. Some showed mysterious islands. Others filled empty waters with strange sea creatures and frightening legends. No one truly knew what waited beyond the distant horizon. Still, curiosity has always been stronger than fear. Shipbuilders worked tirelessly in busy ports. Carpenters shaped strong wooden vessels from oak. Navigators studied the stars each clear night. Sailors learned to trust the compass more than the coastline. Slowly, quietly, Europe prepared itself for voyages unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Among those dreamers was a determined sailor from Genoa. His name was Christopher Columbus. He believed the Western Ocean held the answer everyone had been searching for. Most people doubted him, but history was already beginning to move. One calm wave at a time. For years, Christopher Columbus carried the same dream wherever he went. He believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, he could reach the rich markets of Asia far more quickly than anyone else. Many scholars listened politely, then quietly shook their heads. They believed Columbus had made one enormous mistake. He had greatly underestimated the true size of the Earth. If he sailed west, they argued, his ships would run out of food and fresh water long before reaching Asia. Again and again, his proposal was rejected. Kings refused. Advisors dismissed his calculations. Years passed with little success, but Columbus refused to give up. Eventually, his determination reached the royal court of Spain. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had recently united much of Spain after years of conflict. They hoped to strengthen their kingdom through trade, exploration, and discovery. At first, even they were uncertain. Supporting such an expedition would cost valuable money, ships, and experienced sailors. If Columbus failed, everything would be lost beneath the Atlantic. Still, there was also the possibility that he might succeed. After many discussions, the Spanish monarchs finally agreed. Columbus would receive 3 ships: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Compared with modern ships, they were surprisingly small. The largest was barely longer than many modern houses. Their wooden decks constantly creaked beneath the movement of the sea. Cabins were cramped. Fresh water spoiled quickly. Meals often consisted of hard biscuits, dried meat, beans, and salted fish. Life aboard ship was uncomfortable even before the journey began. Then, on the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the anchors were raised. The sails slowly filled with wind. Families stood upon the shore, waving goodbye to fathers, brothers, and sons who might never return. The coastline of Spain gradually disappeared behind them. Ahead stretched nothing except the endless Atlantic Ocean. For days, then weeks, the ships sailed farther west than most European sailors had ever dared to travel. Every sunrise revealed only water. Every sunset disappeared into the same endless horizon. Some sailors whispered that they had gone too far. Others feared they would sail forever without finding land. But Columbus remained calm. Each evening he studied the stars. Each morning he ordered the ships onward. Without realizing it, the 3 small ships were quietly approaching one of the greatest turning points in human history. The days aboard the 3 ships became slow and strangely repetitive. Each morning began with the same endless view: blue water, blue sky, and nothing in between. There were no landmarks, no distant mountains, no islands rising above the waves, only the endless Atlantic stretching farther than anyone could imagine. At first, the sailors remained hopeful. They believed land would surely appear within a few days. But as 1 week became 2, and 2 became 3, hope slowly gave way to uncertainty. The food grew stale. Fresh water became warm and unpleasant. Wooden barrels leaked. The constant rolling of the sea made sleeping difficult. Even simple tasks became exhausting. The ships creaked day and night. Strong winds pushed them farther into waters no European expedition had ever confidently explored before. Many sailors quietly began counting the remaining supplies. Some wondered whether they would ever see Spain again. Others whispered frightening stories after sunset. Old legends spoke of sea monsters, bottomless oceans, and mysterious waters from which no ship could ever return. Fear spreads quietly among people living far from home. Soon, small groups of sailors gathered together, speaking in low voices whenever Columbus was out of sight. Some believed they should turn back immediately. Others argued they had already traveled too far to return safely. The atmosphere aboard the ships grew heavier with every passing day. Columbus understood exactly what was happening. Although he remained confident before his crew, even he could not know with certainty what waited beyond the endless horizon. Each evening, he carefully studied the stars. Each morning, he examined the wind, the waves, and the flight of birds. Then something began to change. Small branches floated upon the water. Fresh green leaves drifted past the ships. A carved piece of wood appeared, looking as though human hands had shaped it. Then birds began flying overhead. Not seabirds that spent their lives above the open ocean, but birds that usually stayed close to land. The sailors noticed these signs immediately. Hope quietly returned. Eyes remained fixed upon the western horizon from sunrise until darkness covered the sea. Every passing hour felt longer than the last. Then, during the dark hours before dawn, a voice suddenly echoed across the silent ocean. Land, in an instant, everything changed. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The sailor who had shouted stood frozen, pointing toward the darkness ahead. Every pair of eyes turned to the western horizon. At first, no one could see anything, only the gentle movement of the waves beneath the pale moonlight. Then, slowly, a faint shadow appeared against the horizon. It did not disappear with the rolling sea. It remained perfectly still. Land. After more than 2 months upon the Atlantic Ocean, the impossible had become real. Excitement spread across all 3 ships. Some sailors laughed with relief. Others quietly fell to their knees, offering prayers of thanks. Many had believed they would never return home. Now, hope filled every corner of the wooden vessels once again. As the first light of dawn slowly painted the eastern sky with soft shades of gold, the mysterious island became clearer. Tall green trees swayed gently in the morning breeze. Bright white beaches stretched beside crystal-clear water. Colorful birds flew above the forests. Everything seemed peaceful, beautiful, almost untouched. On the morning of October 12th, 1492, Christopher Columbus stepped ashore. He believed he had reached islands near Asia. He had no idea that he was standing upon a continent completely unknown to Europe. The people living there certainly did not think of themselves as discovered. For countless generations, their families had lived, hunted, farmed, traded, and raised children upon these lands. Their homes already stood beneath the same trees. Their stories had been told beneath the same stars for hundreds of years. To them, this morning seemed like any other, until strange wooden ships appeared beyond the sea. The island's people watched quietly from a distance. Their clothing, their language, their customs, everything differed from those of the newcomers. Yet both groups shared the same feeling: curiosity. Neither side truly understood who stood before them. Neither could imagine how deeply this meeting would reshape history. What began as a peaceful encounter between strangers would slowly grow into exploration, settlement, conflict, and enormous change that would transform North America forever. The story of the United States had quietly taken its very first step. News of Columbus's remarkable voyage spread across Europe with astonishing speed. Letters describing strange islands, unfamiliar people, and fertile new lands reached kings, merchants, priests, and ordinary citizens alike. Some could hardly believe the stories. Others immediately recognized an extraordinary opportunity. If one expedition had crossed the Atlantic successfully, many more could follow. Within only a few years, Spanish ships sailed west again and again. Each voyage carried explorers, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and hopeful settlers searching for wealth, land, and a new beginning. Soon, maps that had once shown only empty oceans slowly began filling with newly named islands and coastlines. Yet the greatest surprise still remained hidden. European explorers gradually realized these lands were not the eastern shores of Asia. They had reached an entirely different part of the world, an immense continent that Europeans had never truly known. As the decades quietly passed, Spain built powerful colonies across Central and South America. Gold and silver poured into Spanish ports. The wealth transformed the kingdom into one of Europe's greatest powers. Watching from across the sea, other nations grew increasingly interested. Portugal continued exploring. France searched farther north. The Netherlands looked for profitable trade. England, too, began wondering whether it should claim lands across the Atlantic. English merchants believed the western continent offered something more valuable than gold alone. It offered space, room to build farms, new ports for trade, and opportunities for families seeking a different future. For many years, England made only small attempts. Some settlements disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. Storms, disease, hunger, and isolation defeated many early colonies. Still, England refused to abandon the dream. Each failed expedition taught valuable lessons. Ships became better prepared, supplies improved, Experienced sailors learned safer routes across the Atlantic. Slowly, patiently, England prepared for another attempt. This time, the destination would lie along the eastern coast of North America. The people boarding these ships could never imagine that their small settlement would eventually become the beginning of a nation unlike any the world had ever seen. The next chapter would begin beside a quiet river, at a place that history would remember as Jamestown. The year was 1607. After months upon the restless Atlantic Ocean, 3 English ships finally approached the eastern coastline of North America. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. Their passengers were exhausted. Many had spent more than 4 months surrounded by nothing except endless water and uncertain hope. When land finally appeared, relief quietly spread across every deck. Before them stretched wide rivers, dense forests, and untouched marshes glowing beneath the gentle spring sunlight. To many of the settlers, it looked like the perfect place to begin a new life. The river was deep enough for ships. Fresh water seemed plentiful. Tall trees promised timber for houses and defensive walls. The settlers named their new home Jamestown, honoring King James I of England. Few realized they had chosen one of the most difficult places imaginable. The land was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Much of the surrounding area was marshland. Mosquitoes filled the warm summer air. The river water became salty during high tides and was often unsafe to drink. Within only a few weeks, sickness quietly spread throughout the settlement. Many settlers had arrived expecting to discover gold. Very few knew how to farm. Even fewer understood how to survive in an unfamiliar wilderness. Instead of planting crops, many searched nearby streams and forests for treasures that did not exist. Meanwhile, food supplies slowly disappeared. The settlers depended heavily upon ships arriving from England. Whenever those ships were delayed, hunger quickly followed. Yet Jamestown was not an empty land. For countless generations, the region had already been home to powerful native communities belonging to the Powhatan Confederacy. Their villages stretched across the surrounding countryside. Their hunters knew every forest path. Their farmers understood the changing seasons. At first, both groups watched one another carefully. Sometimes they traded food, tools, and simple goods. At other times, fear and misunderstanding created dangerous tension. Neither side fully understood the customs or intentions of the other. As summer slowly faded into autumn, life inside Jamestown became even harder. Disease claimed more lives. Food became scarcer each passing week. Many settlers quietly wondered whether they had made a terrible mistake. The dream of building a prosperous English colony seemed to be slipping away. Few believed the tiny settlement would survive another year. Yet, against all expectations, Jamestown endured. Its survival would become the first small step toward England's permanent presence in North America, and the beginning of a story that would one day lead to the birth of the United States. Against all expectations, Jamestown survived. It did not happen quickly, nor was it easy. The first years tested every person living behind the settlement's rough wooden walls. Many who had crossed the Atlantic full of hope never lived to see another spring. Disease remained constant. Food was scarce. Clean drinking water was difficult to find. Some winters seemed endless. The settlers slowly realized that surviving in North America required something they had not expected. They would have to learn, not only from one another, but also from the land itself. Gradually, some colonists abandoned dreams of easy riches. Instead, they planted crops, built stronger homes, learned which seasons brought floods, which forests offered good timber, and how to prepare for harsh winters. Among the most important figures during these difficult years was Captain John Smith. Unlike many others, he believed survival depended upon discipline and hard work. His famous rule became known throughout the colony: "He who does not work shall not eat." Although the words sounded harsh, they reflected the difficult reality facing everyone inside Jamestown. Every pair of hands mattered. Every meal depended upon someone's effort. Meanwhile, relationships with the Powhatan Confederacy continued to change. Sometimes peaceful trade provided desperately needed corn and food. At other times, mistrust led to conflict. Neither side fully understood the other's customs, beliefs, or intentions. Small misunderstandings often grew into larger problems. Even so, Jamestown slowly became stronger. Then another unexpected discovery changed everything. The settlers found that the soil and climate were ideal for growing tobacco. At first, few imagined it would become valuable. But before long, ships sailing back to England carried large quantities of dried tobacco leaves. Demand grew rapidly across Europe. Soon, tobacco became the colony's most profitable crop. Fields expanded every year. New settlers crossed the Atlantic hoping to own land and build prosperous farms. Jamestown was no longer simply struggling to survive. It had begun to grow, quietly, slowly, one successful harvest after another. Without realizing it, England had established its first lasting foothold in North America. And far to the north, another small group of travelers was preparing for a very different journey. Unlike the settlers of Jamestown, they were not searching mainly for wealth. They were searching for something they believed was even more precious, a place where they could worship freely. Their voyage would become one of the most remembered stories in American history. In the autumn of 1620, another small English ship quietly prepared to leave Europe. Unlike the settlers who had traveled to Jamestown, the people aboard this vessel carried very different hopes. Many of them were not wealthy merchants. They were not soldiers searching for glory, nor were they explorers hoping to discover gold. They were ordinary families, mothers, fathers, children, people who wished to worship God according to their own beliefs without fear of punishment. For years, they had faced growing pressure in England because of their religious views. Eventually, they decided to leave everything they had ever known behind: their homes, their friends, even the graves of their ancestors. The ship that carried them was called the Mayflower. Compared with modern ships, it was remarkably small. Barely 100 people crowded together below its wooden deck. The air inside was damp and cold. There was little privacy. The smell of salt water mixed with wet clothing, food barrels, and burning lantern oil. As the ship sailed farther into the Atlantic, autumn storms grew stronger. Massive waves crashed against the wooden hull. The entire vessel groaned as though it might break apart at any moment. Many passengers became terribly seasick. Simple tasks such as eating, sleeping, or even standing became exhausting. Some wondered whether they had made the greatest mistake of their lives. Yet every morning, when the storm clouds finally cleared, hope quietly returned. They believed that somewhere beyond the endless ocean waited a place where their children could live in peace. After more than 2 difficult months at sea, the lookout finally spotted land. It was not the place they had originally planned to reach. Strong winds had carried them farther north than expected. Still, after so many weeks upon the ocean, no one wished to continue sailing. The passengers stepped onto an unfamiliar shoreline surrounded by quiet forests and cold winter air. Before building a single house, the leaders gathered together inside the ship. There, they signed an agreement that became known as the Mayflower Compact. It was a simple promise. They would govern themselves together, create fair laws, and work for the good of the entire community. None of them realized that this small agreement, written inside a wooden ship, would later be remembered as one of the earliest foundations of self-government in American history. The first winter in their new home proved far more difficult than anyone had imagined. The settlers had arrived too late in the year to plant crops. Snow soon covered the ground. Cold winds swept in from the Atlantic Ocean day after day. Their small shelters offered little protection against the freezing weather. Food supplies quickly began to disappear. Many families survived on only a few small meals each day. Disease spread quietly through the crowded settlement. The weak grew weaker. Children cried from hunger. Parents wondered whether they had crossed the ocean only to watch their families perish. By the time spring finally arrived, nearly half of the Mayflower's passengers had died. Those who remained carried heavy hearts, yet they refused to abandon hope. Then, one remarkable morning, something completely unexpected happened. A Native American man walked calmly into the settlement and greeted the astonished colonists in English. His name was Samoset. The settlers could hardly believe what they had heard. Only a few days later, Samoset returned with another native man named Squanto. His story was extraordinary. Years earlier, Squanto had been captured by English sailors and taken across the Atlantic to Europe. After many hardships, he eventually found a way back to his homeland. Because of those experiences, he understood both English and the land surrounding the new colony. His knowledge would soon save countless lives. Squanto showed the settlers how to plant corn by placing small fish beneath the soil to help nourish the crops. He taught them where to catch fish, which plants could be safely eaten, where fresh water could be found, and how to survive the changing seasons of New England. Without his guidance, historians believe the colony might not have survived. As summer slowly passed, green fields began replacing empty ground. The first successful harvest filled the settlers with relief and gratitude. To celebrate, they shared a peaceful feast with members of the neighboring Wampanoag people. For several days, they ate together, talked together, and gave thanks for surviving such a difficult year. No one at that gathering could possibly imagine that, centuries later, this quiet meal would be remembered as the first Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, more English ships continued crossing the Atlantic. New settlements appeared along the coast. Tiny villages slowly became growing towns. Without anyone fully realizing it, the foundations of a future nation were quietly taking shape. As the years quietly passed, the English settlements continued to grow. Small villages slowly became busy towns. New families arrived almost every season. Some crossed the Atlantic searching for religious freedom. Others dreamed of owning land that would have been impossible to afford back in England. Many simply hoped for a better future for their children. By the middle of the 17th century, more colonies had appeared along the eastern coastline. Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and several others. Although each colony developed in its own unique way, they all remained part of the English Empire. The king ruled from across the Atlantic. Governors carried out his authority. English laws shaped daily life. Yet the ocean separating England from America was enormous. A message sent from London often required many weeks to reach the colonies. Because of that great distance, local communities gradually learned to solve many problems on their own. Town meetings became common. Neighbors gathered inside simple wooden churches or meeting halls to discuss roads, harvests, taxes, and safety. Ordinary farmers stood beside merchants. Craftsmen spoke alongside landowners. Slowly, without realizing it, the habit of governing themselves began taking root. Meanwhile, life remained difficult. Dense forests still covered much of the land. Every new farm required countless trees to be cut down by hand. Heavy logs became houses. Stone became fireplaces. Fields slowly replaced wilderness. Families worked from sunrise until darkness. Children learned responsibility at an early age. There was always another fence to repair, another roof to build, another field waiting to be planted. Even so, many believed they were creating something their grandchildren would one day be proud of. Trade also expanded rapidly. Colonial ships carried timber, fish, tobacco, and furs across the Atlantic. In return came cloth, tools, books, furniture, and countless goods from Europe. The ports of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston grew busier every year. The colonies were no longer isolated settlements struggling to survive. They had become thriving communities connected by trade, determination, and hope. Yet beneath this quiet success, a new problem was slowly beginning to grow. The colonies were becoming stronger, more confident, and increasingly accustomed to making their own decisions. Far away in London, the English government was preparing new laws and new taxes. Neither side realized that these decisions would soon begin pulling them apart, and eventually lead to one of history's most remarkable revolutions. For many years, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies remained peaceful. The colonists considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown. They celebrated the king's victories. They spoke English. They followed English traditions. Few imagined that one day they would become citizens of an entirely different nation. Then, during the middle of the 18th century, Britain became involved in another costly conflict. It was known in North America as the French and Indian War. For years, British and French forces struggled for control of vast territories across the continent. Native nations, each protecting their own interests and homelands, often formed alliances with one side or the other. The fighting stretched across forests, rivers, and frontier settlements. When the war finally ended in 1763, Britain had won an enormous victory. France surrendered much of its land in North America. On paper, Britain now possessed one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But victory came with a heavy price. The war had left Britain deeply in debt. Its leaders believed the American colonies should help pay the enormous cost of defending the continent. From London, the idea seemed perfectly reasonable. After all, British soldiers had fought to protect the colonies. Surely the colonists should contribute. So Parliament introduced a series of new taxes. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. Later came additional duties on everyday goods. To many people living in America, the amount of money was not the greatest problem. It was the principle. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. No one from Boston, Philadelphia, or Virginia could vote on these new laws. Soon, a simple phrase began spreading from town to town. No taxation without representation. Merchants discussed it in busy ports. Farmers repeated it in country villages. Printers filled newspapers with passionate arguments. Meetings became larger. Conversations became louder. Some still hoped the disagreements could be peacefully resolved. Others quietly feared something much more serious was beginning. The trust that had slowly grown over more than a century was beginning to crack. Neither Britain nor the colonies fully understood how quickly those small cracks would widen. For now, the streets remained calm. The ships still crossed the Atlantic. Life continued much as before. Yet beneath that ordinary routine, the first quiet heartbeat of the American Revolution had already begun. During the early 1770s, tension spread quietly throughout the American colonies. What had once been small disagreements over taxes slowly became something much larger. In towns and villages, people gathered inside taverns, churches, and meeting halls to discuss the future. Some believed the colonies should remain loyal to Britain. Others argued that English rule had become increasingly unfair. Families often found themselves divided. Friends disagreed. Neighbors debated late into the evening. The arguments were no longer about money alone. They were about freedom, representation, and who should have the right to govern everyday life. Then, on a cold December night in 1773, one event changed everything. Several dozen colonists quietly gathered in the busy harbor of Boston. To avoid being recognized, many disguised themselves with blankets and feathers resembling Native American clothing. Silently, they climbed aboard 3 British ships carrying valuable tea. Working quickly beneath the darkness, they opened hundreds of heavy wooden chests, one after another. The tea was thrown into the icy harbor below. By sunrise, the water itself seemed covered with floating tea leaves. The event soon became known as the Boston Tea Party. News traveled across the Atlantic with astonishing speed. British leaders were furious. They believed the destruction of valuable cargo could not go unpunished. In response, Parliament introduced harsh new laws. Boston Harbor was closed. Trade nearly stopped. British soldiers strengthened their presence throughout Massachusetts. Instead of calming the situation, these punishments produced the opposite effect. Many colonists who had remained neutral now began supporting Boston. Food, supplies, and messages of encouragement arrived from neighboring colonies. For the first time, people living hundreds of miles apart started thinking of themselves as standing together, not simply as separate colonies, but as communities facing the same struggle. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued. Farmers still planted crops. Blacksmiths still hammered glowing iron. Children still played beneath quiet evening skies. Yet beneath that peaceful routine, everyone sensed that history was changing. No one could predict exactly when violence would begin, but almost everyone understood that peaceful compromise was becoming less likely with every passing month. The sound of war had not yet arrived, but it was drawing closer, one careful step at a time. In the spring of 1775, the quiet tension that had been building for years finally reached its breaking point. British officials had received reports that colonial militias were secretly storing weapons and gunpowder in the nearby town of Concord. Determined to seize those supplies before they could be used, nearly 700 British soldiers quietly marched out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their mission was meant to be swift and silent, but the countryside was already awake. Messengers rode through the night, warning villages that British troops were on the move. Church bells rang across the countryside. Lanterns glowed in distant windows. Farmers left their beds, gathered their muskets, and hurried toward the roads leading to Lexington. They were not professional soldiers. Most were ordinary people, blacksmiths, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, men who had never expected to stand against one of the most powerful armies in the world. As dawn slowly broke on April 19, 1775, the two sides faced one another upon the village green at Lexington. No one truly wished to begin a war. Both groups stood silently, waiting. Then, somewhere in the confusion, a single gunshot echoed through the cool morning air. Even today, no one knows with certainty who fired that first shot. But once it rang out, everything changed. Within moments, more gunfire followed. Smoke drifted across the field. Several colonial militiamen fell. The British continued toward Concord, believing their mission could still be completed. Yet the road home would prove far more dangerous. As the soldiers marched back toward Boston, colonial fighters gathered behind stone walls, trees, fences, and small hills. Instead of fighting in neat lines like European armies, they used the forests and countryside to their advantage. From hidden positions, they fired carefully before disappearing among the trees. Again and again, the British column came under attack. By the time they finally reached Boston, hundreds of soldiers had been killed or wounded. The fighting at Lexington and Concord was small compared with the great wars that would follow. Yet its importance could hardly be greater. The American Revolutionary War had begun. The colonies had crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. From this moment forward, the dream of peaceful compromise slowly faded, and the long struggle for independence quietly began. As the fighting spread across the colonies, few people believed the conflict would end quickly. Many expected only a few weeks of unrest before peace returned. Instead, those weeks slowly became months, and the months quietly became years. The British Army was one of the strongest military forces on Earth. Its soldiers were well trained. Its navy controlled the seas. Its empire stretched across continents. Compared with Britain, the American colonies seemed small, divided, and poorly prepared. Many colonial soldiers arrived carrying their own hunting rifles instead of military weapons. Some had no proper uniforms. Others marched wearing ordinary farm clothes. Food was often scarce. Gunpowder had to be carefully rationed. Winter camps were bitterly cold. Yet despite these hardships, the desire for freedom continued to grow stronger. In June of 1775, the Continental Congress selected a respected Virginian to lead the colonial army. His name was George Washington. He was calm, disciplined, and deeply respected by those who served beside him. Washington understood that defeating Britain would not be easy. His greatest challenge was not simply winning battles. It was keeping the army alive. Many soldiers completed their service and returned home to their families. Others became sick from disease. Some lacked shoes, blankets, or warm clothing during the freezing winters. Even so, Washington rarely lost hope. He believed patience could become one of his greatest weapons. Meanwhile, people throughout the colonies continued asking an increasingly important question. If they were already fighting Britain, why should they still consider themselves British subjects? The idea of complete independence, once considered impossible, slowly gained support. Writers published powerful essays explaining why the colonies should govern themselves. Ordinary farmers discussed politics beside quiet fireplaces. Merchants debated the future inside crowded taverns. Even children heard conversations about liberty and self-government. Across the colonies, something remarkable was happening. People who had once thought of themselves as Virginians, or New Yorkers, or citizens of Massachusetts, were beginning to imagine a completely new identity. Not 13 separate colonies, but one united people, a people determined to decide their own future. Soon, that dream would no longer remain only a conversation. It would be written into one of history's most famous documents, a declaration that would forever change the course of the world. By the summer of 1776, the question could no longer be avoided. Should the colonies continue living under the rule of the British Crown, or should they become an independent nation? The answer would forever change history. Inside the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, delegates from the 13 colonies gathered once again. The atmosphere was quiet but serious. Outside, ordinary life continued much as before. Merchants opened their shops. Children played along dusty streets. Farmers worked beneath the summer sun. Yet inside that meeting hall, decisions were being made that would influence generations yet unborn. Among the delegates stood a thoughtful young lawyer from Virginia. His name was Thomas Jefferson. He was asked to prepare a document explaining why the colonies believed independence had become necessary. For days, Jefferson sat quietly, writing by candlelight. He carefully chose every sentence. Every word mattered. The document declared that all people were created equal, but they possessed certain natural rights. Among those rights were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It argued that governments existed to protect those rights, and when a government repeatedly failed to do so, the people had the right to create a new one. These ideas were bold, remarkable, and unlike anything many rulers of Europe wished to hear. Then came July 4th, 1776. The delegates approved the final document. It became known as the Declaration of Independence. For the first time, the 13 colonies publicly announced that they no longer considered themselves part of the British Empire. Instead, they declared themselves free and independent states. The decision was both inspiring and dangerous. By signing the declaration, the delegates knew they were risking everything. If Britain won the war, many could be arrested or executed for treason. Still, one by one, they signed their names. Not because victory was certain, but because they believed some ideals were worth risking their lives for. Across the colonies, copies of the Declaration were read aloud in town squares, churches, and public gathering places. Some listeners cheered with joy. Others stood in thoughtful silence. Many realized that the difficult journey toward independence had only just begun. Winning freedom on paper was one thing. Defending it upon the battlefield would prove far more difficult. Although the Declaration of Independence inspired countless people, it did not end the war. In many ways, it marked a new beginning. Britain refused to recognize the colonies as an independent nation. The fighting became even more intense. British armies captured important cities. Powerful warships sailed along the American coastline. At times, victory seemed almost impossible for George Washington and his soldiers. The Continental Army faced constant shortages. Food was often scarce. Boots wore out after endless miles of marching. Blankets were few. Many soldiers wrapped pieces of cloth around their feet to protect themselves from the frozen ground. Winter became one of their greatest enemies. Nowhere was this struggle more painful than at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777. The camp stood beneath deep snow and bitter winds. Simple wooden cabins offered little warmth. Smoke drifted slowly from rough chimneys as hungry soldiers tried to keep warm beside small fires. Disease spread quickly through the crowded camp. Some men became too weak to stand. Others quietly dreamed of returning home. Yet remarkably, most stayed. They believed the hardships they endured might one day give future generations a life filled with greater freedom. George Washington remained beside his army throughout those difficult months. He shared many of the same hardships as his soldiers. His calm determination gave others the strength to continue. Then, during that difficult winter, an experienced military officer from Europe arrived. His name was Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Patiently, he began teaching the soldiers how to march together, load their muskets more efficiently, and fight as a disciplined army. Day after day, practice replaced confusion. Confidence slowly replaced fear. When spring finally arrived, the Continental Army was no longer the same struggling force that had entered Valley Forge. It had become stronger, better organized, more united. Meanwhile, something equally important was happening across the Atlantic. France, Britain's longtime rival, recognized the United States as an independent nation and agreed to provide money, weapons, soldiers, and powerful warships. That alliance would soon change the balance of the war forever. The road to independence remained long, but for the very first time, victory no longer seemed like an impossible dream. By the autumn of 1781, the long years of war had changed everyone. Children who had once watched soldiers march through their villages had grown older. Families had learned to live with uncertainty. Fields had been abandoned. Homes had been rebuilt. Nearly every community carried memories of sacrifice. Still, the struggle was not yet over. British forces remained powerful. Their navy still ruled much of the Atlantic. Many believed the war could continue for years. Then events began moving toward a place called Yorktown, Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis had established his army there, believing it to be a safe position near the coast. He expected support from the powerful British fleet. Instead, something unexpected happened. French warships sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and blocked the entrance. The British Navy could no longer easily rescue Cornwallis or bring supplies. At the same time, George Washington quietly moved his army south. French soldiers marched beside American troops. For weeks, thousands of men traveled dusty roads, careful not to reveal their destination. When they finally surrounded Yorktown, the British Army found itself trapped. Cannons echoed across the countryside day after day. Smoke drifted above the fields. The steady thunder of artillery filled the autumn air. Slowly, British defenses weakened. Food became scarce. Escape became impossible. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered. British soldiers marched out between long lines of American and French troops before laying down their weapons. Many historians consider this the decisive victory of the Revolutionary War. Although peace negotiations would continue for some time, everyone understood that the conflict had reached its turning point. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. For the first time in history, a new nation stood upon the world stage. It was not yet wealthy. It was not yet powerful. Most of its people still lived on small farms or in modest towns. The roads were rough. The government remained uncertain. Countless challenges still lay ahead. Yet something extraordinary had been achieved. Against overwhelming odds, a small collection of colonies had become an independent country. The greatest chapters of America's story were only just beginning. Although the war had finally ended, peace did not solve every problem overnight. Winning independence had been one challenge. Building an entirely new nation would prove to be another. Across the 13 states, people celebrated the end of the revolution. Church bells rang. Bonfires lit the evening sky. Families embraced loved ones returning from years of war. For the first time, Americans could dream about a future that belonged entirely to them. Yet behind the celebrations stood a difficult reality. The young nation possessed no strong central government. Each state largely governed itself. Different states printed their own money. Trade laws varied from place to place. The government owed enormous debts from the Revolutionary War. Many wondered whether the new republic could survive at all. George Washington understood the danger. He believed that freedom alone would not keep the nation together. The country also needed stable laws, trusted leadership, and a government strong enough to unite the states while protecting individual liberty. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia. Their goal was not to begin another revolution. Their goal was to build a government that could endure for generations. For many weeks, they debated inside a quiet meeting hall. Some wanted a powerful national government. Others feared that too much power might create another king. Arguments continued from morning until evening. Compromise after compromise slowly shaped the final document. That document became the Constitution of the United States. It created 3 separate branches of government so that no single person could control the nation alone. Each branch would balance the others. It was an ambitious idea, one that many countries would later study and admire. Soon afterward, George Washington was unanimously chosen as the first president of the United States. He accepted the office with humility, knowing the world's eyes were watching. Every decision he made would set an example for future generations. The United States was still a small country along the Atlantic coast. Its greatest challenges and greatest opportunities still lay beyond the western horizon. A vast continent waited to be explored, and a new chapter of American history was about to begin. As the 18th century slowly drew to a close, the United States remained a young and fragile nation. Its population was still small compared with the great kingdoms of Europe. Most Americans lived in simple wooden homes. Life revolved around farms, small villages, churches, and local markets. Beyond the settled eastern towns stretched an immense wilderness that seemed almost endless. To many families, the western frontier represented hope. Land in the east was becoming increasingly expensive, but beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay millions of acres waiting to be explored. For settlers willing to face uncertainty, the frontier offered the chance to build a completely new life. Slowly, wagons began rolling westward. Entire families packed everything they owned into wooden carts. Furniture, seeds, tools, Bibles, family keepsakes, and dreams for a better future. The journeys were long and exhausting. Roads were little more than rough dirt paths winding through forests and mountains. Heavy rain turned them into rivers of mud. Broken wagon wheels were common. Food had to be carefully rationed. Children often walked beside the wagons for miles each day. Yet few complained. They believed every difficult step carried them closer to opportunity. As new settlements appeared farther inland, another challenge quietly emerged. These western lands were not empty. For countless generations, Native American nations had hunted, farmed, traded, and built communities there. To them, these forests and rivers were ancient homelands, not unexplored frontiers. As more settlers arrived, misunderstandings grew. Small disputes over land, hunting grounds, and resources gradually became larger conflicts. Many peaceful agreements were reached. Many were later broken. The consequences would shape American history for generations. Meanwhile, the young government faced another remarkable opportunity. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson completed one of the most important purchases in American history. Known as the Louisiana Purchase, it doubled the size of the United States almost overnight. Millions of acres of forests, rivers, plains, and mountains now became part of the growing nation. No one fully understood what lay across that enormous territory. Maps showed blank spaces. Great rivers disappeared into unknown lands. Towering mountains remained unexplored by Americans. Jefferson knew the country needed answers, so he prepared an expedition unlike any before. Its journey would reveal landscapes beyond imagination and forever change how Americans understood their own continent. In the spring of 1804, two explorers quietly prepared for one of the greatest journeys in American history. Their names were Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Chosen by President Thomas Jefferson, their mission seemed almost impossible. They were asked to travel across the vast Louisiana Territory, map rivers that no American government had ever carefully recorded, meet the native nations living there, study unfamiliar plants and animals, and, if possible, discover a practical water route leading toward the Pacific Ocean. No one knew exactly what awaited them. Large portions of the continent remained blank spaces on American maps. Some believed towering mountains blocked the way. Others imagined endless grasslands stretching beyond the horizon. Many simply admitted that nobody truly knew. With a small group known as the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark left St. Louis and slowly followed the Missouri River westward. Their boats moved against powerful currents day after day. The work was exhausting. Sometimes every man climbed into the cold river to pull heavy boats forward with ropes. Other times they pushed long wooden poles against the riverbed, inching the vessels upstream. Summer brought unbearable heat. Mosquitoes filled the evening air. Winter arrived with freezing winds that swept across endless plains. Yet the expedition continued. Along the journey, they encountered many native nations. Some welcomed the travelers with friendship and trade. Others watched cautiously, uncertain why strangers had entered their homelands. Lewis and Clark understood that peaceful relationships were essential. Without local knowledge, survival would become far more difficult. One of the most remarkable members of the expedition was a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. Carrying her infant son upon her back, she helped guide the explorers through unfamiliar country. She translated conversations, recognized important landmarks, and often prevented dangerous misunderstandings between different groups. Her presence became a symbol of peace. As months turned into more than a year, the expedition crossed sweeping grasslands, climbed the towering Rocky Mountains, and finally reached rivers flowing west toward the Pacific. At last, after thousands of exhausting miles, the explorers stood beside the vast Pacific Ocean. Before them stretched another endless horizon. Behind them lay a continent they had helped reveal to the young United States. Their remarkable journey inspired countless Americans. Soon, more settlers would begin following the paths they had opened, and the nation would continue its long march toward the western horizon. As more Americans looked toward the western horizon, a powerful belief slowly began to spread throughout the young nation. Many people came to believe that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. Years later, this idea would become known as manifest destiny. To many settlers, Moving west represented hope. They dreamed of fertile farmland, fresh beginnings, and opportunities that seemed impossible to find in the crowded eastern states. Thousands of families loaded everything they owned into sturdy covered wagons. Furniture, cooking pots, seeds, farming tools, family Bibles, and treasured photographs were carefully packed for the long journey ahead. Leaving home was never easy. Some would never again see the towns where they had been born. Still, hope proved stronger than fear. Long wagon trains slowly crossed endless grasslands beneath wide blue skies. The Oregon Trail became one of the most famous routes westward. Its journey stretched for more than 2,000 miles. Travel often lasted 5 or 6 exhausting months. Dust covered every wagon. Summer heat became unbearable. Rivers had to be crossed without bridges. Sometimes powerful currents swept away wagons, supplies, and livestock. Disease spread quickly among travelers. Simple illnesses that seem minor today could become deadly far from doctors or medicine. Even so, the long lines of wagons continued moving west. Children gathered firewood each evening. Parents repaired broken wheels beside campfires. At night, countless stars filled the sky above the quiet frontier. The journey demanded patience, courage, and determination. Yet the western lands were not empty waiting for newcomers. For thousands of years, Native American nations had lived across these plains, valleys, deserts, and mountains. Their ancestors had hunted buffalo, built villages, raised families, and developed rich cultures deeply connected to the land. As more settlers arrived each year, peaceful cooperation became increasingly difficult. Competition over land, water, and hunting grounds created growing tension. Some communities traded peacefully for years. Others experienced conflict that brought great suffering to everyone involved. The West offered extraordinary opportunity, but it also carried enormous human cost. Still, the United States continued expanding. With every new settlement, every new road, and every new state, the young republic slowly transformed into a nation stretching farther across the continent than its founders could ever have imagined. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had grown beyond anything its founders could have imagined. New towns appeared almost every year. Small frontier villages slowly transformed into busy communities filled with schools, churches, workshops, and marketplaces. Steamboats carried goods along great rivers. Canals connected distant regions. Roads gradually improved. The nation seemed to be moving forward at an astonishing pace. Then, in 1848, everything changed once again. Near a small sawmill in California, a worker named James Marshall noticed something shining beneath the clear water of a stream. It was gold. At first, only a handful of people knew about the discovery. But news has a remarkable way of traveling. Within months, stories of gold spread across America and far beyond its shores. Almost overnight, thousands of people abandoned their ordinary lives. Farmers left their fields. Sailors deserted their ships. Shopkeepers closed their businesses. Young men packed their belongings and hurried west, believing fortune waited just beyond the mountains. The Great California Gold Rush had begun. Some traveled by wagon across endless plains. Others sailed around the southern tip of South America. A few crossed the dangerous jungles of Panama before boarding another ship along the Pacific coast. The journeys were long, expensive, and often deadly. Yet hope drove them onward. Every traveler dreamed of discovering a single nugget large enough to change life forever. Most, however, found something very different. Gold was difficult to find. Many spent months searching without success. Some earned more money selling food, tools, clothing, or building supplies than those digging beside the rivers. Still, the gold rush transformed California forever. Tiny settlements rapidly became thriving towns. San Francisco grew from a quiet village into one of America's busiest ports within only a few years. Ships arrived from every corner of the world carrying people speaking dozens of different languages. The population of the United States continued growing faster than ever before. Yet beneath this remarkable progress, another problem was quietly becoming impossible to ignore. As new territories joined the nation, one difficult question returned again and again. Would slavery be allowed in these new lands? Or would it end? The answer would divide families. challenge the nation, and eventually lead America into its darkest chapter. Even as the United States continued expanding westward, the nation found itself increasingly divided. The question of slavery could no longer be postponed. Northern states were becoming more industrial. Factories, railroads, and growing cities transformed daily life. Many people there believed slavery should not spread into the new Western territories. In the South, however, vast plantations depended upon the labor of enslaved men, women, and children. Cotton had become one of the world's most valuable crops. Entire local economies depended upon it. Many Southern leaders feared that ending slavery would destroy their way of life. With every new territory joining the Union, the same argument returned. Would it enter as a free state or a slave state? The debates grew louder each year. Inside Congress, politicians argued for hours. Across the country, newspapers published passionate opinions. Families found themselves divided. Friends disagreed. Neighbors who had once lived peacefully together now viewed the future very differently. Then, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. Lincoln believed slavery should not expand into the Western territories, though his immediate goal was preserving the Union. To many people in the South, his election signaled a future they feared. One by one, several Southern states announced that they would leave the Union. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America. The nation that had fought so hard for independence was now splitting apart. Church bells still rang. Children still attended school. Farmers still harvested their crops. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, everyone sensed that something terrible was approaching. Families packed belongings. Young men volunteered for military service. Railroads carried soldiers instead of ordinary travelers. The sound of drums echoed through towns that had known only peace. Neither side expected the coming conflict to last very long. Many believed a single decisive battle would settle everything. Instead, the United States stood at the edge of the deadliest war in its own history. Within only a few months, the first shots would be fired, and the Civil War would begin. The first shots of the American Civil War were fired before sunrise on April 12, 1861. In the quiet harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a small Union fort standing upon an island. The thunder of cannons echoed across the water. Smoke slowly rose into the morning sky. For many Americans, the moment felt unreal. Years of political arguments had finally become war. News spread with astonishing speed. Church bells rang. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Young men across both the North and the South eagerly volunteered, believing the conflict would be over within a few months. Almost no one imagined it would last for long years. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the United States. The Confederacy fought to establish itself as an independent nation. Soon, enormous armies marched across forests, rivers, and open farmland. Battles grew larger than anything America had ever witnessed. At places like Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg, thousands of soldiers met beneath clouds of smoke and thunder. The fighting was brutal. Cannons shook the earth. Musket fire echoed across rolling hills. Doctors worked day and night inside crowded field hospitals. Many soldiers never returned home. Families waited anxiously for letters that sometimes never arrived. Entire towns mourned fathers, brothers, and sons lost far from home. As the war continued, President Lincoln came to believe that preserving the Union alone was no longer enough. Slavery itself had to end. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in the rebelling states were to be free. Although freedom did not come instantly to everyone, the war had gained a new and powerful purpose. It became a struggle not only to save the nation, but also to end slavery. The conflict continued with terrible determination. Year after year, battle after battle, both sides suffered unimaginable losses. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy could no longer continue fighting. Its armies were exhausted. Its cities lay in ruins. Its supplies were nearly gone. The end of the Civil War was finally approaching. Soon, the United States would be reunited once again. But the cost of that reunion had been greater than anyone could have imagined. In the spring of 1865, the long and devastating Civil War finally came to an end. After years of exhausting battles, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The sound of gunfire slowly faded. For the first time in 4 years, the nation could begin imagining peace again. The cost, however, had been heartbreaking. More than 600,000 soldiers had lost their lives. Countless others returned home carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Entire towns had been destroyed. Railroads, bridges, farms, and cities lay in ruins. Almost every American family had been touched by loss. Yet despite the enormous suffering, the Union had survived. The United States remained one nation. Even more importantly, slavery was coming to an end. Later that same year, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. For millions of formerly enslaved people, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Freedom had finally arrived. Although true equality would remain a long and difficult struggle, history had taken an irreversible turn. Sadly, only a few days after the war ended, another tragedy shocked the country. On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, he was assassinated. The news spread rapidly across the nation. People gathered in silence. Church bells rang once again, not in celebration, but in mourning. Many Americans wept openly. Lincoln had guided the nation through its darkest years, yet he would never witness the peace he had helped preserve. As the country slowly recovered, workers rebuilt railroads and factories. Farmers returned to their fields. Children once again filled schoolhouses. The nation looked toward the future instead of the battlefield. Within only a few decades, remarkable inventions, expanding industries, and growing cities would transform the United States faster than anyone could have imagined. A new age was quietly beginning. The age of industry, invention, and extraordinary economic growth. As the smoke of the Civil War slowly disappeared, the United States entered one of the most remarkable periods of transformation in its history. The nation that had once been made up mostly of small farms and quiet villages began changing before people's eyes. Factories rose beside rivers. Steel mills filled the air with the glow of molten metal. Railroad tracks stretched across valleys, mountains, and endless plains. Every year, the country seemed to grow faster than the year before. Perhaps nothing symbolized this new age more than the railroad. In 1869, workers completed the first transcontinental railroad, connecting the eastern and western United States by rail for the very first time. What had once required months of dangerous travel by wagon could now be completed in only days. Goods moved faster. Letters arrived sooner. Families traveled farther than ever before. The nation felt smaller, more connected, and full of new opportunity. At the same time, millions of immigrants crossed the Atlantic Ocean searching for a better life. They came from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, and many other parts of the world. Most arrived with little more than hope and determination. Some became farmers. Others found work in factories, mines, or on the expanding railroads. Their labor helped build the rapidly growing nation. Meanwhile, inventors introduced extraordinary new ideas. Thomas Edison developed practical electric lighting. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone allowed voices to travel across great distances. Soon, cities that had once fallen into darkness after sunset began glowing with electric lights. Factories worked longer hours. Businesses expanded. Daily life changed in ways previous generations could scarcely imagine. Towering buildings rose above crowded streets. New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became symbols of American industry and ambition. Yet this period of rapid growth also brought new challenges. Factory workers often labored for long hours in dangerous conditions. Many families struggled despite the country's growing wealth. Large companies became increasingly powerful. The gap between the richest and poorest Americans widened. Even so, by the end of the 19th century, one thing had become clear. The United States was no longer a small, struggling republic along the Atlantic coast. It was becoming one of the world's greatest industrial powers. And as a new century quietly approached, Events beyond America's shores would soon draw the nation onto the global stage like never before. As the 20th century quietly began, the United States found itself standing at the edge of a new era. Its factories produced enormous quantities of steel, machinery, and manufactured goods. Its railroads stretched from coast to coast. Its cities continued growing taller with every passing year. Millions of immigrants still arrived, believing America offered opportunities unavailable anywhere else. Yet beyond the Atlantic Ocean, Europe was becoming increasingly unstable. Powerful nations competed for influence. Military alliances formed. Armies expanded. Few ordinary people realized that the world was slowly drifting toward one of the greatest conflicts in human history. Then, in the summer of 1914, the First World War began. Across Europe, millions of soldiers marched into battle. For the first few years, the United States remained officially neutral. Many Americans believed the war was a distant European problem. President Woodrow Wilson hoped the nation could avoid becoming involved. But remaining neutral became increasingly difficult. American ships crossed the Atlantic carrying food, supplies, and trade goods. German submarines attacked many vessels at sea. In 1915, the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania shocked public opinion. Hundreds of civilians lost their lives, including American passengers. Even then, the United States did not immediately enter the war. The final turning point came in 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. At the same time, British intelligence revealed the famous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany secretly encouraged Mexico to join the war against the United States. The message deeply alarmed the American people. Soon afterward, Congress declared war. Thousands of young Americans volunteered for military service. Others worked in factories producing uniforms, weapons, ships, and medical supplies. Women entered industries in greater numbers than ever before, helping keep the nation's economy running while millions of men served overseas. When fresh American troops arrived in Europe, they strengthened the exhausted Allied forces. In November 1918, after years of terrible fighting, the guns finally fell silent. The First World War had ended. Although the United States had entered the conflict later than many other nations, its economic strength, industrial production, and military support had helped shape the final outcome. For the first time, the world had begun to see the United States not only as a growing nation, but as an emerging global power. Yet an even greater challenge still waited just beyond the horizon. During the 1920s, the United States experienced a period of remarkable growth. Factories produced automobiles at record speed. Cities expanded rapidly. Radio stations filled homes with music and news. Electric lights brightened streets that had once fallen silent after sunset. Many Americans believed the future would only become brighter. Businesses prospered. Families purchased new appliances. The stock market climbed higher almost every year. Optimism seemed endless. Yet beneath the surface, serious weaknesses quietly remained. Many people borrowed money they could not easily repay. Banks made risky investments. Stock prices rose far beyond their true value. Then, in October 1929, everything changed. The stock market suddenly collapsed. Fortunes disappeared almost overnight. Banks closed their doors. Businesses failed. Factories stopped production. Millions of hardworking men and women lost their jobs. The difficult years that followed became known as the Great Depression. Across the country, long lines formed outside soup kitchens. Families struggled to buy food. Some lost their homes. Others traveled from town to town searching for any kind of work. Despite these hardships, communities often helped one another. Neighbors shared meals. Churches organized food drives. Small acts of kindness gave many families the strength to continue. Then, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. He introduced a series of programs known as the New Deal. Roads, bridges, schools, dams, and public buildings were constructed across the nation. Millions found employment through these projects. Although recovery was slow, hope gradually returned. Just as America slowly began rebuilding its economy, troubling news arrived from overseas. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany. In Asia, Japan continued expanding its military influence. Across much of the world, another great conflict was quietly taking shape. Once again, Many Americans hoped the nation could remain outside a distant war. They remembered the terrible losses of the First World War. They wanted peace. But history often follows its own path. Before long, events unfolding thousands of miles away would once again reach American shores, and the United States would soon enter the largest and most destructive war the world had ever known. By the late 1930s, another storm was gathering across the world. Germany invaded neighboring countries. Italy expanded its ambitions. Japan continued its military campaigns across Asia. One by one, peaceful nations found themselves drawn into a conflict that soon became known as the Second World War. The United States watched from across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Most Americans hoped to remain neutral. The memories of the First World War were still painful. Families had no desire to send another generation of young men into battle. Instead, America focused on helping its allies by producing food, trucks, airplanes, ships, and weapons. Factories worked around the clock. Shipyards became busier than ever before. Yet the nation itself was still officially at peace. Then, on the quiet morning of December 7th, 1941, everything changed. Without warning, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Explosions shook the harbor. Battleships burned. Aircraft were destroyed before many could even leave the ground. More than 2,000 Americans lost their lives that morning. News of the attacks spread across the nation within hours. Families gathered around their radios in stunned silence. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. He described the attack as a date which will live in infamy. Soon afterward, the United States officially entered the Second World War. Millions of Americans answered the call to serve. Some joined the Army. Others entered the Navy, Marine Corps, or Army Air Forces. At home, factories transformed almost overnight. Automobile plants began producing tanks instead of cars. Civilian factories manufactured airplanes, ammunition, and military equipment. Women stepped into jobs that had previously been held mostly by men, becoming an essential part of the nation's wartime workforce. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, American forces fought beside allies in some of history's largest military campaigns. The war demanded enormous sacrifice, yet it also revealed the extraordinary industrial strength of the United States. By supplying not only its own military, but also many of its allies, America became known as the arsenal of democracy. Without fully realizing it, the nation was preparing to emerge from the war stronger than ever before. When the Second World War finally came to an end in 1945, the world looked very different from the one that had entered the conflict only 6 years earlier. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Millions of families mourned loved ones who would never return home. The cost of the war had been almost impossible to measure. Yet, unlike many nations, the United States emerged with its industries stronger than ever. Its factories had supplied not only American forces, but also many of its allies. Its farms had fed millions. Its scientists had developed remarkable new technologies. Its economy expanded rapidly during the years that followed. Soon, American universities attracted students from around the world. New highways connected distant states. Air travel became increasingly common. Scientific discoveries transformed medicine, communication, and daily life. American companies introduced inventions that reached homes across every continent. Hollywood films, jazz, rock and roll, television, and later the internet carried American culture to nearly every corner of the globe. The nation was not perfect. It still faced difficult struggles over civil rights, equality, poverty, and justice. Each generation continued working to build a better future than the one before. Yet the story of the United States remained one of constant change. From ancient forests wathed by native nations, to tiny English settlements struggling to survive, from a revolution for independence, to a painful civil war that preserved the Union, from railroads crossing a continent, to factories powering the modern world. Every generation added another chapter to a story that is still being written today. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson history leaves behind. No great nation is built in a single lifetime. It grows slowly, through countless ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices, one generation after another. Now, the long journey has come to an end. The forests have grown quiet once again. The rivers continue their endless journey toward the sea. The campfires have faded into glowing embers. The voices of the past have become gentle whispers carried upon the evening wind. So let your breathing become slower. Let your thoughts quietly drift away. And allow the history of this remarkable land to gently fade into peaceful dreams. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. Sleep well, and until our next quiet adventure through history, good night.